Galiziatik, zatozen irakasle, ikerlariak, baita ere, Santiago de Compostela eta A Coruñako Unibertsitateetatik, hemen Lorenzo Santiagoko Unibertsitatekoa ez da edo egin, eta bere ordez A Coruñako Unibertsitateko usio daukagoa ezkerrean, eta herrialdean Euskal Herriko Unibertsitateko Bizkaiko kampuseko errektordordea, Carmelo Eskerrezko, etortzeratik, Bizkaiko diputazioa laguntzaile dugu kongresu hau antolatzeko unean, eta hemen dugu Gonzalo Bizkaiko diputaziotik, eta gero Euskal Herriko Unibertsitatetik gaur eguneko historia saileko burua Sarrera Hitzaldia.mp4 da hemen ekarri Barcelonako Unibertsitatetik. Emango diete hitza eta onartu behar diazue, eta bizikoan bintzen itzulpenik ez egitea. Beraz, lehendabizi unibertsitatekoak hitz egingo dute, eta gero azken hitza errektoreak izanen du. Beraz, lehendabizi gure unibertsitateko zuzendariak hitz egingo du, eta Sarrera Hitzaldia baten dute hitza.
Eskarrik asko etortzeagatik. Kale euskara hitza esaten dugunean, bi errealitate aztertzen ditugu. Batetik, 1923an hasi zen prozesu politiko bat, Kataluniako, Galiziako eta Euskal Herriko alderdi abertzaleak bildu zituena, 1923an, 1923an, Erbeslean, azkeneko urte hauetan. Errealitate politiko bat, emaitza mugatu eman dituena, herrialde bakoitzaren ezaugarriak desberdinak zirela. Baina errealitate desberdin horrek izan ditu baita ezaugarri komun batzuk, eta ezaugarri komun nagusi izan da, hain zuzen, bakoitzak nazio bat izan nahi zuela, eta nazio ezaugarri zituela. Eta horien arteko elkartasuna garrantzioa izan da, lotura politikoak baino, eta denboran zehar bere funtzioak eman ditu, ezta? Eta funtzioak eman ditu, bai idazleen artean, kale euskal literario dela eta hasiera bere emaitzak ematen historialaren artean. Eta nire gustatuko litzaideak hitz labur hauetan behintzat azaltzea nola denboran zehar historialaren artean, edo unibertsitateko irakasleen artean, eta ikasleen artean, zen horako loturak edo planteatu nahi izan dira. Decía que Galeuska representa, por un lado, unas relaciones políticas entre partidos nacionalistas, por otra parte, unas relaciones culturales, unas relaciones académicas, que es lo que tiene que representar este encuentro. Y a mí me gustaría subrayar, por lo menos aquí, este segundo aspecto, porque yo creo que hace ya mucho tiempo que existe esa inquietud, que existe entre esas regiones o entre esas naciones que tienen cada una lengua propia, unos contactos, y a pesar de que las realidades de las que parten son diferentes, la necesidad de la unión o de la relación entre ellos pues, se ha manifestado una y otra vez, ¿no? Son realidades diferentes porque, entre otras cosas, tanto Santiago, en primer lugar, o Galicia en general, o Cataluña han tenido universidad desde hace mucho tiempo. En el caso del País Vasco, la universidad pública tiene una trayectoria mucho más corta, pero bueno, yo que he estado trabajando sobre el desarrollo de la Universidad Vasca en estos últimos tiempos, me encontré sorprendido, por ejemplo, cuando en el diario ABC, Aurelio Ribalta, que fue uno de los fundadores del Grupo de Estudios Gallegos, defendió la creación de la Universidad Vasca y la defendió con una serie de argumentos que hoy en día yo creo que los suscribiríamos y que son los argumentos que también dieron lugar en Barcelona a la creación de la Universidad Autónoma en los años 30 y que de alguna forma está en el desarrollo universitario que se ha producido en los últimos 30 o 40 años en este país, ¿no? Ribalta hablaba de la Universidad Autónoma, que es la forma que entonces se defendía en la Universidad Vasca, y decía, debe contener, además de los estudios de aplicación general, la preparación para el conocimiento especializado de las industrias del país, el medio de formar por sí mismo su profesorado, libertad de redacción de planes de estudio y programas, a creación a su seno de toda enseñanza que nazca en el país y de toda la investigación científica que en el país se realice, a fin de no encontrarse apartada de las manifestaciones de la propia cultura. Y por último, debe darse a sí propia, en sus facultades y en sus alumnos, la libertad para modificar los planes de estudio y hacer que la acción universitaria no se consuma en sí misma. Esto lo decía Sarrera Hitzaldia en el año 1919, al defender la Universidad Vasca, y yo creo que de alguna forma nos creeríamos todos. Las universidades, y en este caso los departamentos de historia, en los últimos 20 o 30 años, llevan desarrollando buena parte de ese programa. Es decir, uno de los ejes fundamentales de nuestra investigación es el estudio de nuestro propio país. Lo sorprendente, o también lo que deberíamos reflexionar, es por qué después de tantos años de democracia en España, la relación entre los departamentos de estas naciones o estas autonomías que tienen cada uno elementos propios ha sido tan escaso, ¿no? Y estamos en el año 2012 y estamos celebrando el segundo congreso y no el 12º. Pero bueno, yo espero que, como hemos visto en las comunicaciones que hay y el éxito de estas jornadas, pues tengamos un tercer congreso y cada vez sea más intensa la relación entre los departamentos y los historiadores de cada una de esas autonomías. Muchas gracias.
Eskerrik asko, Sarrera. Berba bi mesedez Coruñako Unibertsitatetik, Eusio, dos palabras, por favor, Eusio, de la Universidad de Coruña, de Lorenzo.
Buen día a todas e todos. Efectivamente, hubo que facer un cambio de última hora. Sustituyo aquí a un outro colega. Sustituyo aquí, decía, a outro colega en gallego, a Lorenzo Fernández Prieto, que en este momento no se puede dirigir a las y a los presentes. En todo caso, decir desde las historiadoras y los historiadores aquí presentes y los que aquí no están presentes, pero en todo caso se suman a este encuentro, que estamos de enhorabuena en cuanto que años atrás ya, en el año 2008, lanzamos un manifiesto que firmamos buena parte de las y de los que estamos aquí, y fue aquel 75 aniversario de Galeusca histórico, que generó aquel manifiesto, en buena medida germen de estas jornadas, de estos congresos que bianualmente estamos celebrando, y que de manera entusiasta a los que, digamos, nos sumamos, en este caso desde Galiza. Las tres universidades gallegas y otras instituciones como la Asociación Galega de Historiadores, el Instituto Galego de Historia, Murguía, Revista Galega de Historia, etc. En todo caso, esperemos que sean, como en el primer encuentro fueron, totalmente fructíferos los debates, las ponencias y el diálogo, que es fundamental, entre los integrantes de las tres naciones aquí representadas desde la perspectiva historiográfica. Gracias.
Carles Barcelonako Unibertsitateko Gaur Historia Saileko zuzendaria.
Egunon, buenos días, buen día. Decía ahora el profesor Aizpuru por qué hemos tardado tanto en realizar un encuentro de este tipo. Y Musillo nos recordaba brevemente los orígenes, de dónde surgió y cuándo surgió esta idea. Yo creo que es cierto que en los últimos años la investigación ha progresado notablemente, pero una investigación pensada desde cada uno de los ámbitos y que cuando se ha entrado en relación no lo ha hecho directamente, sino que lo ha hecho a través de otros ámbitos, ¿no? En este sentido, en el ámbito, digamos, historiográfico español. Con Galeusca lo que se consigue es que haya un ámbito de relación entre estos tres ámbitos, digamos, de reflexión historiográfica que nos permiten, yo creo, entrar en una posibilidad de historia comparada, que es siempre un paso importantísimo en el progreso del conocimiento histórico, que nos lo permite hacer de manera totalmente libre y desde la perspectiva de cada uno de estos territorios que, naturalmente, como también se indicaba, son muy distintos. Yo creo que precisamente de estas diferencias también se aprende muchísimo, porque uno ve qué es lo que puede explicar en particular, qué es lo que comparte con otros, dónde están los momentos en los que los ritmos cronológicos, las intensidades de determinados procesos históricos, pues tienen una respuesta más o menos desde un territorio, o responde más o menos pues, a pautas más generales. Yo creo que este es el elemento de fondo que nos ha traído aquí. Yo quería pues, agradecer a la Universidad del País Vasco, al grupo de parlamentarismo, a Joseba, a las instituciones que nos han permitido, pues nos permiten dar celebrar este segundo congreso, que yo creo que con la implicación de los departamentos aquí representados significa un paso adelante, es decir, de un surgimiento desde una base de personas preocupadas por este déficit que teníamos, hemos pasado a darle una forma. Primero, digamos, se ha recordado el primer congreso, podría decir que casi hubo un congreso cero, digamos, un seminario previo, un primer congreso y este segundo, con una implicación institucional mayor, que yo creo pues, que de alguna manera es la respuesta adecuada a lo que nos planteamos y a yo creo que a un recorrido que tiene que ser necesariamente largo. Esperemos pues, que los trabajos correspondan con las expectativas. Yo creo que sí, al menos a tenor de las comunicaciones que se han presentado, de los títulos y además que hemos podido leer resúmenes, algunos muy extensos de los trabajos, y confiemos en que las jornadas sean fructíferas.
Gonzalo Olabarria, Bizkaiko Diputazioa Kultura Saileko zuzendari.
Eskerrik asko, Joseba. Bueno, en primer lugar, agradecer la invitación a la organización para que hoy la Diputación Foral de Bizkaia pueda estar presente. Eskerrik asko, bihotz. Eta egun on guztioi eta ongi etorriak Bilbora Bizkaiko Foru Aldundiaren izenean. Buenos días a todos y a todas. Es para mí un placer daros la bienvenida a Bilbao y a Bizkaia. Estatu nazioen baitako nazioak, naziogintza, kulturala eta politikoa, gaur egungo Europan. Naciones en el Estado-Nación, la formación cultural y política de naciones en la Europa contemporánea. Como todos y todas sabéis, este es el sugerente título que tiene el segundo Congreso Galeuska Historia que hoy tenemos el honor y el placer de inaugurar. Desde la Diputación Foral de Bizkaia entendemos que hay, si me permitís, tres aspectos a resaltar, enfatizar en este Congreso. El primero de ellos, y como ya se ha mencionado en esta mesa hoy, es su intento de abordar la historia, nuestra historia, la historia de nuestras comunidades desde un punto de vista más abierto, superando el estrecho corsé de los actuales estados y entender que existieron comunidades y que existen comunidades que por diversas circunstancias históricas no llegaron a constituirse en estados. Esto no significa que no hayan tenido su historia. En segundo lugar, porque a la vista del programa no solo se pretende analizar los hechos históricos, sino también se visionan, se visualiza la importancia de los hombres y mujeres en la historia de nuestras comunidades, desde un punto de vista abierto, intentando no juzgar, sino indagar, comprender y explicar el papel que todos y todas tuvieron a lo largo de nuestra historia. Y en tercer lugar, porque este Congreso entendemos que es una muestra más de la necesidad de recuperar la memoria histórica y permitir un mejor y más veraz conocimiento de nuestro pasado, lo cual obviamente nos permitirá entender mejor nuestro presente y abordar el futuro con una sociedad más cohesionada y más preparada. Beraz, eskerrik asko, Galeuska taldeari eta kongresu hau aurreratzen duzuen guztioi. Sin más, y por estos motivos y por mucho más, agradecer el esfuerzo organizativo realizado por todas las universidades aquí presentes y en nombre de la Diputación Foral de Bizkaia, agradeceros vuestra presencia en Bilbao, en Bizkaia, y desearos que este congreso sea todo un éxito. Eskerrik asko, bihotz.
Eskerrik asko, Gonzalo. Eta azkenik Euskal Herriko Unibertsitateko erretorrea dugu, eta Carmelo Garita Mendiari gure eskerrik denak hemen egoteagatik, eta hemen izterik eta beraira hori eskenitza.
Eskerrik asko zueri, egun on guztioi eta ongi etorri Euskal Herriko Unibertsitatera. Me siento muy orgulloso como vicerrector de la Universidad del País Vasco de estar en este segundo congreso de Galeuska. Hace cerca de 80 años aparecía en el diario Euskadi el nombre de Galeuska, nombre que se atribuye a los dirigentes del Esforo Monzón y a Josep María Batista, y simbolizaba, ya lo decía el profesor Aizpuru, la unión de los tres movimientos nacionalistas en los años de la República. Aquella alianza, como saben, tuvo corta vida, pero el nombre de la Neuska ha tenido y tiene un largo futuro y ha servido para el desarrollo y la celebración de todo tipo de eventos que compartimos los tres países, Galicia, Euskadi y Cataluña, entre otros, estos encuentros de historia. Aunque los medios de comunicación durante estas últimas semanas han debido compartir la crisis con la final de la Copa de Mano para nosotros en Euskal Herria y la Eurocopa para todos los países europeos, hoy lunes volvemos a estar ante la dura realidad, la crisis, la política de ajustes y la recesión económica, que nos acompañará este año y probablemente una buena parte del 2013. La recesión económica obliga a las instituciones que financian la docencia y la investigación a determinar prioridades en la distribución de recursos. Todas y todos estamos muy preocupados por los recortes en la financiación de la docencia y de la investigación en la educación, y en particular en la universidad, en el aumento de las tasas académicas, en el aumento de las horas docentes del profesorado y en la disminución de las partidas de investigación. ¿Por qué es importante mantener el nivel de inversión en el presupuesto educativo y universitario? Porque la docencia y la investigación son la base de la sociedad de mañana. La humanidad ha evolucionado, se ha desarrollado porque ha investigado. Si nos limitáramos a transmitir conocimiento, a reproducir el conocimiento de nuestros padres, nos hubiéramos quedado anclados en la edad de piedra. Este año se han defendido 320 tesis doctorales en la Euskal Herriko Unibertsitatea y en los últimos años hemos registrado más de 200 patentes, 20 de ellas licenciadas para su explotación comercial. La producción científica en el Estado durante la última década ha crecido en un 80% y hoy constituye el 3,4% de la producción científica mundial. Esta investigación se debe en sus 2/3 partes a las universidades. Este esfuerzo ha convertido al Estado español en la 9ª potencia científica y en la 8ª, repito, si no me han oído bien, en la 8ª en publicaciones por habitantes, resultados similares a Japón. Es verdad que en transferencia, en el número de patentes que licenciamos, no tenemos unos números tan impresionantes, pero diré en nuestro descargo que el Estado español solo destina el 1,39% del Producto Interior Bruto a I+D+I, muy lejos de la media de la OCDE, que está en el 2,3%. Estoy seguro que todo este capital humano, los estudiantes, los graduados, los futuros másteres y los nuevos doctores, en una palabra, también ustedes, investigadores y expertos que están hoy aquí, son la base de la sociedad del futuro y los auténticos ladrillos con los que vamos a edificar la sociedad del conocimiento. Nada más, antes de terminar, quería expresar en 2 palabras mi agradecimiento a todos los profesores y profesoras que han contribuido a la celebración de este congreso, en particular a los que han venido de Galicia, de Cataluña y de otros países, a los organizadores. Me van a permitir que cite al profesor Albert Azcuena y al director del Departamento de Historia de nuestra universidad, Mikel Aipuru, a todas las asociaciones profesionales, sociedades científicas y instituciones que han contribuido y apoyado la celebración de este congreso, y en particular me van a permitir que agradezca a la Bizkaiko Foru Aldundia, Diputación Foral de Vizcaya, que representa hoy su director de Cultura, Gonzalo Olavarría, que contribuye al sostenimiento generoso de toda clase de actividades científicas y culturales en Vizcaya y en el País Vasco. Nada más por mi parte, que tengan mucho éxito en su trabajo en este segundo congreso. Gracias, eskerrik asko, moltes gracias, gracias.
Eskerrik asko, eta orain Hitzaldia Stefan Bergerek iconografía que hemos recuperado gracias a la colaboración del Archivo del Nacionalismo de la Fundación Sabino Arana. Esta iconografía fue creada por indicación, por mandato de Castelao, el dibujante Néstor Basterretxea, con 17 años en Buenos Aires. La anterior era de Muñoa, pero esta que hemos utilizado aquí es de Néstor Basterretxea, y nos ha concedido el permiso Néstor Basterretxea para usarla para este acto, e incluso más aún, le hacía ilusión, que es una persona muy mayor, en asistir a una de las jornadas, y a partir de las 12, probablemente el propio Néstor Basterretxea vendrá aquí. Fue una iconografía de los primeros actos de Galeusca en Buenos Aires, Argentina. Y de nuevo hemos recuperado un poco donde se representan distintos elementos iconográficos con una inspiración un tanto modernista, pero hecha por un artista de 17 años. Daukagu eta privilegioa da guztiontzako Stefan Henrik Berger irakaslea. Bera irakaslea da hain zuzen be Europako historia komparatiboan, Manchesterko Unibertsitatean, eta on Borruk Rurreko movimiento sozialen zuzendaria da bertako institutuan. Berak historiografian eta nazionalismo da nazio identitate da nazio ideien azterketa komparatiboak egin ditu. Da horrez gainera, Europa mailan historiografian egin da izugarrizko lan baten zuzendaria bada. Kurrikulumari dagokionez, Poloniako Unibertsitatean hasi zen, gero Inglaterran, Plymouth, Cardiff eta azkenik Manchester, Jean Monnet katedrako zuzendaria dugu. Da, beren lanen artean bat aipatuko dut, 2005koa, Return to the National Parliament, interlazioen artean, National History Writing in Germany, Italy, France and Britain from 1945 to the present. Hori da, artikulu bat labur bilduten duguna, baina gero hainbat tomotan egin du horrelako ikerketak, eta horregatik guk eskatu dioguna da, hain zuzen be, the British Islands, edo Inglaterra inguruko tekstu inguru horretan izandako nazioak eta gaur egunean historiografiari buruz zer esaten da, zer idazten da, zer aztertzen den. Es una suerte y un honor que haya aceptado el profesor este campesino, al cual agradezco sinceramente que comparta estos minutos con nosotros, puesto que es una referencia de historia comparada y en historiografía comparada sobre movimientos nacionales y sobre continentes nacionales. Ha sido el director de la European Science Foundation de un programa sobre historiografía que ha producido 4 excelentes libros. Tiene artículos de referencia como puede ser el posible retorno del paradigma nacional con interrogantes y las tradiciones sobre historias nacionales en Alemania, Italia, Francia y el Reino Unido, y por lo tanto tendríamos que ir a la persona idónea a explicarnos el ejemplo o lo que sucede en estos tiempos, en estos momentos, en los últimos años en el Reino Unido, un Reino Unido con 4 naciones identificadas y reconocidas como tal, y con una producción historiográfica en las universidades británicas sobre temas de historiografía de gran valor y de referencia para todos ellos. También en 2010, con esto cito, un último trabajo que coordina con Chris Lawrence sobre la nacionalización del pasado, o procesos de nacionalización del pasado. Es una publicación del 2010 y que tanto nos implica a nosotros como historiadores y como investigadores del pasado. Y el reto, este es un título que nosotros le propusimos, el comité de organización le propuso y aceptó el profesor Berger, como correcto de explicación cuál es, ¿no?, la historiografía en los últimos años en el Reino Unido en los distintos momentos, etc. Y sin más preámbulos, le cedo la palabra al profesor Berger.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Joseba and to the organizers of this conference for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to be here in the city that is the birthplace of my wife and that I had not the chance to visit before, so it's nice to do that. And at the same time, apologies that I cannot, in such a multilingual surrounding, address you in any of the languages that are more usually spoken around here. So I'll have to speak in English, I'm afraid. I brought the PowerPoint presentation so that at least sort of some of the things are there in writing as well. I was asked by Joseba to speak about contemporary and more contemporary trends in British national historiography, in particular the move towards what is normally called the New British History, which is associated to a large extent with the notion of a Four Nations historiography. And the abstract that is part of your conference papers is far more dealing with the 19th and early 20th century. So following Joseba's comments, I will concentrate more on the contemporary period today. So should you wonder that there are certain discrepancies between the abstract that you have in your folder and what I'm going to say now, it is due to this modification of the paper that I did. See whether this works. No? Do I have to do the big one? This one, okay. Right, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start off with what you could call a certain tendency to lament the decline of English national history, and following on from that I will talk a little bit about why this lament has come about. So talk a little bit about what you might term the deconstruction of English national history over the last 30 years or so. And both of this I will try to do in a comparative perspective by pointing to similar or different developments in other parts of Europe. Then in the third part I will talk about this Four Nations history, which has been very prominent in British national history over recent years, and again ask whether we can find parallels in other parts of Europe. And then I will talk about two aspects of national histories which have become increasingly important for the national paradigm overall. First of all, empire history, imperial histories, which had arguably one of the strongest impacts on the change in the national paradigm in history writing, and popular history, which also has had considerable effect on the way that national histories are conceptualized in Britain today. And then finally I will end with some reflections on where British national history might be going in future. I don't have a magic touch. Oh, there we are. Right. So, starting with the lament for English national history, I brought you a quote from one of the most famous television historians in Britain, David Starkey, who is an expert on the Tudors, and there are endless television series on British television to do with kings and queens of the Tudor age. He is or was one of the highest earners in television in Britain. He has long given up his academic job because he doesn't need it anymore, but he is, I think, one of the most prominent public historians in Britain today. And giving the Medlicott Lecture in 2001, the Medlicott Lecture is an annual lecture by the Historical Association. He talked about English national history, and he said, amongst other things, "I do not know how history, in any sense that I understand it, which is not associated with a national story, can actually survive. Maybe we have a future as a series of disparate regions of the European Union, perhaps as a greater city-state, in other words, a greater London. But where a history, where an English history fits in, a sense of England as a place that once existed, that once mattered, that once was glorious, I'm really not sure." So we have here, on the one hand, the reaffirmation of the importance of national history, saying that in fact it is almost the only kind of history that he can imagine. And secondly, then this lament for the loss of an English national history, a sense of an English national history. And this notion of a lament has a considerable history of its own. One of the most popular English historians of the 20th century, Arthur Bryant, who wrote a whole series of national histories of Britain and of England, amongst which perhaps his multi-volume English saga is the most prominent. Arthur Bryant, throughout the second half of the 20th century, was precisely a voice which echoed this lament for a loss of an English national history. And the slippage here is deliberate because in Starkey and in Bryant and in many of those historians who lament the loss of English national history, there is a slippage between English and British. And this slippage is one which is characteristic of the British national paradigm for much of the modern period. Bryant's history writing was deeply anti-European. He distrusted continental Europe. He didn't like the European project. He disliked continental European history, pretty much in the sense that he was in favor of not so much a splendid isolation, but a form of Englishness stroke Britishness which connected with the world rather, and especially the world of empire, rather than the world of continental Europe. He was nostalgic for that past empire, for the greatness that he associated with that empire. He was, in many respects, a close ally of the Conservative government in the 1980s, of Margaret Thatcher. Many of his ideas underpinned the kind of history politics that were prominent in Britain in the 1980s and fed into the debates about national school curriculum in history that was first adopted under Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. And much of his view of English history can be summarized in a way that it was Anglo-centric, very much focused on the English, pretty much like another famous representative of English historiography, A.J.P. Taylor, once claimed that his book on English history had very little on the Scots and the Welsh because, as he put it, they simply didn't matter in British national history. So Bryant also Anglo-centric, very much Anglo-Saxon, so this kind of Anglo-Saxonism which came from the 19th century and saw in a kind of Anglo-Saxonism the core of what it was to be British. Of course, it excluded the Celtic nations in Britain. It was Protestant, so the sort of Anglican, Christian underpinnings of the British nation were, the English nation were emphasized. It was monarchist, in that he deeply believed in the monarchy as a central institution of England/Britain. He also was an anti-Semite in the 1930s, a fascist fellow traveller, someone who had a lot of sympathy for the Nazis in Germany, but in a way much more important than that, I would say, in understanding what made Brian tick is his romanticism, the notion of a kind of unchanging, timeless, and above all superior character of the English, which informed all of his publications, all of his many publications on English national history. Now, if we look elsewhere, then we can see that this lament for the passing of national history, a national history that could serve as positive identification with the nation state, was not really peculiar to Britain at the end of the 20th century. It is something that we can, in fact, find in many countries in Europe at the end of the 20th century. If we look to Germany, already in the 1980s, we have the German Historikerstreit, the historians' controversy, which ultimately were connected with attempts to renationalize German identity and German history, something which was an ongoing project which accelerated after reunification in 1990 and resulted in renewed attempts to write national master narratives for the reunified Germany in the 1990s and 2000s. We also have these laments in Italy, where the crisis of the Italian nation state after the Tangentopoli crisis produced a series of defenses of the patria, of the Italian nation state, and an attempt to somehow ward off attempts to compartmentalize Italy, and in particular in the light of the challenges to the Italian nation state by the Lega Nord, attempts to defend the national tradition and the tradition of the Italian nation state. Similarly, in France, we have in 1989 a major crisis of the understanding of national histories, which focused around new interpretations of the French Revolution, the Great French Revolution of 1789, which had been the anchor point of a republican French tradition for 2 centuries, and this kind of anchor point was becoming more and more problematic, and in the light of this, there was also, again, a crisis, a sense of crisis of the notion of national history and national identity, to which several historians rallied in the 1990s, 2000s, and the starting point of this rallying movement arguably was Fernand Baudel's 2-volume L'Identité de France, published in the mid-1980s, which was an attempt by the foremost representative of the Annales school to ironically return to a form of national history writing that the Annales, of course, had famously disavowed in the post-war period. And of course, we also have lament for national history and a return to national history in Eastern Europe after the breakup of communism, most visibly in Yugoslavia, where the crisis of the Yugoslav national paradigm led to the revival of a variety of national paradigms on the sub-state level, leading and justifying acts of ethnic cleansing and mass murder for the first time in Europe after the Second World War. So we can see that the British developments have certain parallels elsewhere in Europe at the end of the 20th century, and I think it is not by chance that most of these parallels can be found in large states or in multinational states where there were particular challenges to the national paradigm, which either came from reinterpretation of central aspects and elements of that past, or came from various regionalisms which increasingly turned into nationalisms in the late 20th century. Now, if we return to Britain and we ask, well, what were these historians like Starkey, like Bryan, what were they actually lamenting about? What was it that they were missing? What was it that they were harking back to? Then I think in the case of Britain, stroke England, it is very clearly a triumphant English master narrative which was dominant in English historiography from the mid-19th century to at least the 1960s. A dominant paradigm which is usually referred to as Whig history, Whig historiography, and that is usually associated with Thomas Babington Macaulay, whose English history was the most prominent expression of the idea that English history was essentially constitutional history, that English history was essentially a history of the extension of the idea of liberty over the course of many centuries, and that this idea of constitutional history, the history of liberty, was developing into a kind of civilizational history, that it was this growth of liberty which characterized English national history, and this kind of paradigm is upheld then throughout much of the 19th and 20th century, amongst others by his relative George Macaulay Trevelyan, who was arguably the most prominent representative of social history in the early 20th century, but a kind of social history that was also informed by this Whiggish notion of history as the extension of liberties. Trevelyan once famously compared British and French history, arguing that if the French aristocracy had only been able to wine and dine their peasants like the English aristocracy, then the French Revolution might never have happened. Herbert Butterfield, who allegedly was the one historian who criticized this Whig history, who wrote a whole book denouncing Whig history, was still someone who, in his personal belief systems and in much of his historical writing, continued to endorse central elements of the Whig historiography, as the most recent biographer of Butterfield has emphasized. And of course there is also a distinguished tradition of an émigré historiography in England, associated with names such as Louis Namier and Geoffrey Elton, both of which came from East Central Europe to England, who in their very different ways prolonged this notion of a Whig historiography. In Namier's case, despite the fact that he was deeply critical in his own writings about Parliament and parliamentary affairs of the more obvious public Whiggism that was associated with that particular set of ideas. But his hatred, his dislike of continental Europe and especially of Germany meant that in essence he still very much retained elements of that Whiggism. So we find that in England, and again compared to many continental European countries, I would say we find in England a much more stable, a much more uncontentious, a much more harmonious national paradigm in history writing, simply because it could rely on the support of vast sections of the historians and the political establishment, whether they were conservative or liberal, over the course of almost 1.5 centuries. One example of that is George Trevelyan's speech that he wrote for King George V on the opening of Parliament in 1935. where he said, in this sort of critical year of the mid-1930s, "It is to me a source of pride and thankfulness that the perfect harmony of our parliamentary system with our constitutional monarchy has survived the shocks that have in recent years destroyed other empires and other liberties. The complex forms and balanced spirit of our constitution were not the discovery of a single era, still less of a single party or of a single person. They are the slow accretion of centuries, the outcome of patience, tradition, and experience constantly finding outlets. For the impulse towards liberty, justice, and social improvement inherent in our people down the ages." I think this is missing there. So you can see how this notion of the Whig history of historiography informs the political process in England well into the 20th century. Why then, we might ask, does this cease to be the case from roughly the 1960s onwards? And here I would argue that the challenge to this dominant Whig history of historiography comes from, first, the rise of Celtic nationalisms in Britain from the 1960s, and secondly, from an increasingly post-national academic history writing in Britain. That interpretation, again, sets Britain, in my view, apart from much of continental Europe, where most of the challenges to the national master narratives in the post-1945 period come via histories of the Second World War. In Germany, the Fischer controversy in the late 1950s and early 1960s focuses on the continuities between the search for German hegemony in Europe from the First to the Second World War. In Italy, many of the debates surround the Resistenza, the resistance in the Second World War, and its particular role in national history, whether one could see the Resistenza as a kind of second Risorgimento, which was the dominant interpretation put forward by historians such as Gaetano Salvemini and others in the post-war period, or whether indeed there was rather a continuity between the Risorgimento and Italian fascism in the 1920s. And of course in France there is the notion that the resistance represented, whether it was communist resistance or Gaullist resistance, it represented the best traditions of France until, under the influence of Robert Paxton's seminal book of 1973, the continuities between French national history and the Vichy regime became the topic of major debates, to an extent that Henri Rousseau could write 30 years later of the Vichy complex informing much of French national historiography. So my argument would be that in Britain it's different. It's not the Second World War. The Second World War, which of course widely interpreted as Britain's finest hour, it continues to be widely interpreted as Britain's finest hour. It is more the Celtic nationalisms and an increasingly post-national academic historiography. Now, what is it more precisely, then, you might ask, that lead to the deconstruction of that English, Whiggish national paradigm or national history? And I think there are a variety of things, a sort of complex mixture of developments which lead to the demise of the English national paradigm. There is, for a start, very strong social criticism which has been looking for a different national history, ranging from the Fabians, from Sidney and Beatrice Webb, or the Hammonds in the late 19th century, right through to historians such as R.H. Tawney and G.H. Cole in the interwar period, further then to the Communist Party Historians Group, which assembled some of the brightest minds in historiography in the post-war period, E.P. Thompson, Eric Hobsbawm, Rodney Hilton, a whole range of very well-known British historians who belong to the Communist Party Historians Group. Secondly, the notion of the People's War, the Second World War as the People's War, also led in the realm of historiography to a breakthrough to social history, and that social history again challenged some of the assumptions of the dominance of constitutional history in British historiography. Thirdly, I would argue the economic decline of Britain in the post-war period, the kind of sick man of Europe syndrome that came to characterize the political debates in Britain after 1945, also led to a demise of the kind of self-confidence with which British national historians have portrayed the course of British history over many centuries. Scottish nationalism in particular, Tom Nairn wrote his famous prediction of the breakup of Britain already in the 1960s as well, was another reason for the fact that it became increasingly difficult to maintain that slippage between England and Britain that was so characteristic for British national history in the 19th and first half of the 20th century. The rise of the new British history, in particular with David Canadine's debate that he initiated in Past and Present in 1987, and then Linda Colley's seminal book about Britons from 1989, which really is the starting point of this new British history. The impact of post-colonialism and of the new imperial history, the rise of the subaltern studies group, first on the Indian subcontinent, but then with important repercussions on the writing of imperial history in Britain. The attention that was focused on the role of empire in integrating the Celtic nations, the Scots and the Welsh, into an entity called Britain in the 19th century. And finally, the move that is also present in Britain, the move to comparative, transnational and global forms of history writing, all of these elements together arguably led to the decentering of English national history and the rise of this lament for English national history. The outcome of all this was then, from the late 1980s onwards, the rise of the four nations history in Britain, which is associated largely with the name of Hugh Kearney, the first one to write a book-length treatment titled British Isles, A History of Four Nations, and the argument being that you could really only understand the history of Britain if you wrote the history of Britain as a history of four separate nations: England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland. And that paradigm has been very influential ever since the late 1980s. Arguably the most famous treatment of British history in that vein was Norman Davis's The Isles of 2000, where he again stressed the discontinuity, the lack of uniformity of British history, denying precisely that kind of continuous, ongoing constitutional progress that was at the very heart of the Whig history of historiography. The UK, he contended, was never a nation state, and Britishness had a particular function during the age of empire, which of course by implication was arguing that as the age of empire was over, Britishness had no function, and therefore, like Nairn, Davis also ends his history of Britain with predictions about the breakup of Britain. He focused very much on those views that had been minority views under the old Whig historiography. His book was very pro-Catholic, for example, challenging the Protestantism of the British national narrative, and his book was also very positive about the history of the Celtic nations on the British Isles, the Scots and the Welsh in particular, which were portrayed as victims of the English. And as much as he was trying to deconstruct English national history, as much he was trying to construct Scottish and Welsh national history, which methodologically, I would argue, is a certain contradiction in his book, that he is intent on almost demolishing the sense of an English or a British national history, but he is introducing through the back door lots of the kind of essentialisms and mythologies that he criticizes for England, for the smaller Celtic nations of Scotland and Wales. If we look towards other multinational states and their histories, I would argue we again can see a variety of similarities to the developments in England. And I'm starting with Spain, but as you can see, speaking in what is still a region of Spain, I've introduced lots of question marks on this PowerPoint slide because I feel much less confident in front of this audience speaking about this than about other aspects of history. It seems to me, at least from a very much an outsider perspective, that in Spain we have, after the transition from Franco, also a kind of historiography which focuses very much on the national histories of Catalonia, of Galicia, of the Basque country, following this kind of coffee for all policy of the transition governments after Franco, a boom in the national histories of the smaller nations within the multinational state of Spain. Linked to this, the question of the relationship of Spain and of the smaller nations within Spain to Europe, so the question of how these national narratives relate to a wider European narrative. Linked to that also the coming to terms with the Francoist past, where some of the national histories that were booming after Franco were trying to nationalize, I would say, the anti-fascist struggle, to use it in a way to put on the agenda the new national history that they argued had to be written after the Franco years. Like in Britain, imperial histories are also an important part of the process of discussion about the place of Spain and the place of smaller nation states within Spain. If you take Catalonia, for example, the discussion surrounding the medieval Mediterranean empire. If you take Spain as a whole, as a multinational state, the discussion surrounding the Spanish Atlantic, all of this seems to point to me to the fact that, again, the issue of empire was an important issue in the debates surrounding national history paradigms from the late 1970s onwards. The notions about post-colonialism, whether some of the smaller nation states within Spain and their history could be understood using post-colonial paradigms, echoes the debates about post-colonialism that we find in Scotland and in Wales. And in terms of possible others, we also, of course, have the discussion surrounding Arab Spain and its impact on the construction of national master narrative. So, in some respects, I would say lots of similarities between the multinational state of Britain and the multinational state of Spain in the kind of historiographical debate surrounding national master narratives. I'm running out of time, so I won't go through this here in great detail, but if we look at a variety of other nation states which are multinational, such as Belgium or Denmark, or in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia or Yugoslavia, we can see also that in many of the historiographies we find parallels to the debates in Britain, and I would argue that the parallels are rooted in the fact that we see a major crisis of multinational states from the 1980s onwards, a crisis which leads to the emergence of national historiographies below the nation-state level, the emphasis being on state here, and I don't have the time to go through this, but if we were to go through, I think we could demonstrate the fact that all of these multinational states suffered these crises of the national historiographical paradigms. Again, for time reasons, I will not discuss British imperial histories and also not the popular histories. Perhaps there is time to do that over coffee or in the discussion. Let me perhaps just finish with some general remarks regarding where British national history might be headed. I think in some respects, almost 50 years on from Tom Nairn's prediction of the breakup of Britain, Britain is still waiting for this breakup, and whether it will happen or not is very unclear, but it seems to me that the trend of the new British history, the trend of defining national history through the writing of 4 separate national histories, is a development which ultimately will further the agenda of the breakup of Britain, because it treats, if you like, and Norman Davis shows this very clearly, it treats particular regions of the British Isles as separate entities already. And this is, I think, I would argue, historically very dubious, because as Kearney himself said in his 1989 book, there's only one way of organizing the history of Britain. You might as well, Kearney said, organize the history of Britain not as separate histories of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, but you could also look at the history of Britain as major differences between highland and lowland areas. Because you could organize a history of Britain along those lines, and it would make a lot more sense than organizing it along national lines. Because a lot of the social developments, a lot of the economic developments that were going on in Britain had more to do with the division between highlands and lowlands than with the division into allegedly national entities. Thirdly, I think one of the historiographical problems is that England has so little sense of itself as a federal entity. It's not so much that there is no sense of English history, but there is very little sense of the differences within England, which is why I think politically the program of devolution in England is bound to fail. And as long as we do not get devolution in England, there is also, I would argue, a very little hope of maintaining the union with Scotland in particular in the medium term. Europe is of course interpreted again very differently in Britain and in the historiographical treatments of the 4 nations, whereas we see in the Celtic national historiographies and historiographies of Scotland and Wales a very pro-European tinge. We see, at least in some of the histories of England, a very anti-European tinge. I mentioned at the beginning Bryant as a prime example of that anti-European streak. Interesting also to reflect on Richard Evans's latest book entitled Cosmopolitan Islanders, where he emphasizes the tradition in British historiography of cosmopolitanism, of dealing with the histories of other nations than the British. What Evans is arguing that if you look at national historiographies almost anywhere in Europe, you see that most of the historiographies have been obsessed with the history of their respective nation-states, that most of the historians of France, of Germany, of Spain, of Italy were also historians of those nation-states, and that England or Britain is somehow different because for a very long time historians in Britain have not only focused on Britain but have a long and distinguished tradition of dealing with the historiographies of other nations. And I think by extension one could make the same argument about the United States. And I think it is also for this reason that English language historiography had such a big impact on other national historiographies. If you look at Dennis McSmith and his impact on Italian historiography of the 1960s, if you look at Blackburn and Ely and their impact on German historiography, if you look at Paxton and French historiography, or indeed if you look at Paul Preston and his influence on Spanish historiography, it is characteristic that we have a series of English language historians who had an impact on national historiographies other than their own, which you do not find in reverse. So what that means for the historiography of Britain is also, I think, a big question mark. Finally, it could of course also argue whether all of these historiographical debates actually do matter, because if we believe the statistics, then what we see in Britain as in other places of Europe is that a majority of the younger people increasingly do not see their identity tied to an understanding of the past and of history. It is to some extent indeed a kind of frightening loss of a historical perspective which seems to characterize younger generations, not just in Britain but in Europe today. So in that sense you could also ask whether all of these concerns and debates and arguments about the national past and its impact on the present have any meaning today. If we again finally look at this in comparative perspective, I would like to leave you with a series of questions which we could debate for a very long time, I'm sure. It seems to me that out of the crisis of national history writing in Britain and in Europe, a series of questions emerge. Are some national histories more unproblematic than others? So if you contrast, for example, the national history of Germany and the national history of England, could you say that, well, you know, Germany indeed had a deeply problematic history, and to sort of rest a sense of German identity on German history, therefore, has to remain deeply problematic. But if you look at England, well, it wasn't really all that bad. You know, it has a long history of liberalism, of democracy, of freedom. But of course, it also raises the question, well, are some of these interpretations leaving out large chunks of British history? For example, the dark side of empire, the sort of mass murder, genocide that are associated with the history of the British Empire. The Mau Mau, just one prominent example that has been discussed internationally to a considerable extent. Second question, is liberal nationalism possible and desirable? Can we actually come to a definition of nationalism as a liberal nationalism that is cosmopolitan, that is open, that is in some respects fulfilling the dream of Mazzini and other 19th century exponents of nationalism, which see it as a kind of liberating ideology? It seems to me that so often in history, this sense of a good patriotism has changed into a sense of a xenophobic nationalism, that the two, patriotism and nationalism, are so strongly interrelated that, again, it might be deeply problematical to come to definitions of positive liberal nationalism. But there are, of course, many out there who disagree with that interpretation. Are we therefore, if we think that national histories are ultimately a dangerous game to play, are we therefore inclined to move towards more playful national histories? A kind of notion of the nation and national history as a broken mirror. If you look into a broken mirror, you see lots of different images of yourself depending on which angle you look into that mirror. And should we therefore write national histories which allow this kind of playfulness, this kind of reflection about positionality, about that you might actually look at things very differently if you look into the mirror from a different angle or from a different position. Fourthly, can we build solidarities below the level of identities? An argument that Alan McGill put forward some years ago, that in some respects it would be better to try and build solidarities on which communities obviously depend. You know, the famous questions, why should anyone pay taxes if there isn't the kind of sense of solidarity in a community? Can we build those solidarities below the level of identities, including national identities? Because any kind of identitarian politics has this tendency of defining them versus us, of needing sort of images of enemies in order to build those solidarities. And then finally, how important are national identities to the everyday lives of people? Because if we look at much of oral history, of much of everyday life history, we see that there is, to a considerable extent, an absence of these issues. So is the kind of national discourse, a kind of meta-discourse, which really in so many aspects is not really relevant to the lives of people that they sort of live in their everyday. But again, big questions which I cannot hope to answer here. Apologies for running over time, and thank you very much for listening.
Si alguien desea hacer algún comentario, una pregunta, sobre esa visión compartida general sobre la cuestión que le hemos planteado, es el momento de iniciar un primer turno de preguntas. Tenemos una sesión de historiografía y quizás los que han presentado y para presentar finalmente las ponencias sobre historiografía tengan alguna pregunta. Enrico. O alguna otra persona.
Una pregunta.
Bueno, levántate para que... Yo se va a ver.
¿En qué medida esta historia comparada, este esquema de historia comparada europea, podría tener, existen realmente conocimientos sólidos sobre estas historiografías que no son de Estado? En el caso británico sí que existen y están sistematizadas, pero en casos como el catalán, el vasco, el gallego, estas historiografías no han sido puestas en común a un nivel europeo. Entonces es muy difícil que estas historiografías entren en un juicio general a nivel europeo. Entonces, este desconocimiento inicial hace muy difícil una análisis comparativa. En el caso vasco, gallego y catalán, creo que existe una problemática previa que es el conocimiento mismo de los ejes básicos de estas historiografías, para poderlas comparar. Por ejemplo, en este sentido, nosotros estamos en una fase previa a darnos a conocer todavía. El conocimiento, por ejemplo, expresado en la intervención sobre las historiografías hispánicas, evidencia una cronología histórica limitada. Es decir, que como si, evidentemente la intervención hablaba de los años 80, pero antes de lo que es el franquismo, existe una historiografía catalana, vasca, gallega. Entonces, el gran reto, pienso, y esto será uno de los grandes retos que tenemos en esta sesión de hoy, es precisamente esto: cómo podemos darnos a conocer para precisamente entrar dentro de una análisis comparativa de Europa. Este creo es un problema fundamental, previo a estos planteamientos que se pueden hacer desde una tradición multinacional que se ha desarrollado, como en el caso británico, ¿no? Que realmente ha conseguido.
Well, I mean, I think you're right in pointing out that obviously, in some respects, the states and all of the possibilities that they have in promoting particular historiographies and particular views of history have been traditionally and continue to be very important. So in that sense, I think state-supported historiographies have invariably an advantage over non-state supported historiographies. But I would also see in Europe an attempt to promote the historiographies of stateless nations, partly through a process of federalism where the state funding comes through particular forms of federal government. Just to give one example, I'm a member of an organization called NISE, which is funded by the Flemish government, which is an association which is trying to unite, I mean, several of you might know this association, is trying to unite the small and often stateless nations of Europe in an association which looks after the historiographies of those stateless nations and promotes and compares those historiographies on a European level. So I think there are several attempts in contemporary Europe to promote the historiographies of stateless nations and increase the awareness, not only within multinational states, but also the awareness in Europe as a whole of those historiographical traditions and of the histories that are associated with those historiographical traditions. So in some respects, you could argue that the moves towards a more federal politics that we have both at the level of the nation state and at the level of Europe have increased the opportunities and the possibilities for historiographies of stateless nations to become visible, to sort of raise their profile beyond the confines of their particular nations. I think another matter, related matter, is that of the national publics that we have. And there, of course, issues of language and of communication and of media are very important, in the sense that we, of course, have continuously failed in Europe to produce a European public sphere, in the sense that our communication systems, our media systems are still highly nationalized. So in that sense, there is no real debate, and there is de facto in academia and other areas we are using, some might hate it, some might like it, but we are in fact using English as a lingua franca, which still means that at least those who are not capable to use that lingua franca remain voiceless. And of course, with many of the smaller nation states, from the little I know about the Basque Country, that includes the Basque Country, that identity to some extent is so much linked to linguistic identity that using your own language becomes a major part of that. Certainly true for Wales, where I lived for more than 15 years. And if you have that, then you are sort of increasingly reluctant to move towards a language that, in the Welsh case, also is the language of, in inverted commas, the oppressors for such a long time. But that, of course, confines you to a very narrow audience and makes it precisely impossible to give people outside of Wales a sense that there was something like a Welsh national history underpinning a sense of a Welsh national identity. So I think whilst on the one hand we have traditions of federalism and Europeanism which help to give stateless nations also a historiographical voice, we also have developments in the realm of communication and media, public sphere, which makes that more difficult.
Enrique, has partido del contexto finalmente ha explicado el contexto de Welsh, y una de las conclusiones, una de las sugerencias también directamente que nos atañe es que como no produzcamos en la lengua franca, pues finalmente no vamos a poder...
Sí, mi intervención iba más en un advertimiento, en el sentido de que todavía en la reunión actual nosotros estamos planteándonos una fase previa incluso, ¿no? Previa de conocernos a nosotros mismos, ¿no? En este sentido. Es que es un poco complicado explicarlo.
Vamos a dar otra palabra. Yo sé.
Thank you very much, sir. My question is referred, I'm personally interested in indigenous peoples, and my point was you were talking about the history of Britain and history of the four nations. I would open that framework, yes, to cover the reality of indigenous peoples in Australia, in New Zealand, Canada, because they are still using the reference to treaties signed with the Queen in many cases, and even like 2 weeks ago the Queen went to New Zealand, so there is this link. So my question is how they fit in this new history of the British, because you know, you were talking about, I would say, invisible. I will try to, in my presentation, just to link, I would say, like nation people here in Europe with indigenous people, but if we want to go like global, I would like to know your response to this, because indigenous people in many places are really making new historiographies and really, I would say, questioning, you know, like the whole idea of Eurocentric, you know, colonialist science. So I would like to have your opinion about this. Thank you very much.
I mean, I didn't have time to talk about the role of empire in changing the national history paradigm, but it falls into that category, I think, because if you look at the evolution of the new British history from the 1980s onwards, one of the really important interventions came from John Pocock in an article where he, as a New Zealander and as one of the most prominent historians of Britain, was worried by the fact that Britain, by going into Europe, would in fact forget its ties to the Commonwealth and to the Empire, and was arguing that therefore, also in history, it was important to maintain that historical link and to say, well, Britain might, for political reasons and for economic reasons, in the second half of the 20th century, find it appropriate to move into Europe and to forge alliances with Europe. But historically, of course, it should not forget that it always had very strong links with a whole range of other nations across the globe. So that then feeds into the imperial history that sort of receives a major boom again from the late 1980s, early 1990s onwards, because imperial history in Britain in the era of decolonization after 1945 was practically non-existent. I mean, there were very few historians, very few institutions which did imperial history between the 1940s and the 1980s. And that, of course, changed completely to the extent that today imperial history is perhaps one of the most booming and most well-represented areas of British history overall. Now, in terms of indigenous peoples, of course, the kind of sort of First Nation paradigm that has been so influential in places like Australia and North America, of course, always raises the question of origins and of ethnic origins of nations. And in many European countries, including Britain, this has always been a kind of poisoned chalice, because where are the ethnic origins of so many European nations? And in a country, even like, if you look at Wales, for example, who are the Welsh? Which of the many waves of migration of peoples that have moved to Wales are the origins? And usually these things are sort of getting lost in the sort of mist of time, and then we have no historical sources, and we only have mythologies, and we really know very little about these tribes who might have lived there at some stage or another and were wiped out by other tribes. And so I think it would be very difficult in many European cases, and I know not enough about North America and Australia, but it would be certainly for Europe very difficult to move into a discussion of ethnic origins of nations, which is also, I think, why many historiographies shy away from this and sort of rather concentrate on other aspects of national history rather than the kind of First Nation. And I think it's true to say that in many historiographies, at least contemporary historiography, it's a different issue if you look at the 19th century. I mean, if you look, for example, of 19th century, late 19th, early 20th centuries of Irish history, there are endless discussions about the beginnings of Irish history and the various virtually unpronounceable names of tribes that move to Ireland and sort of get wiped out in other tribes, and the question of the origin is very prominent there. But I think even nowadays that is rarely the case. Or if you look at another prominent example, France, and Jules Michelet's History of France, which he starts with a great tableau of the origins of France. But you can see there also very clearly how he struggles with the fact, well, how do we, what kind of ethnicity, what kind of ethnic roots do we give to those? And of course, then in the course of his French history, he very much decides to root that history in the kind of rebirth in the French Revolution, and becomes one of the great founder of the Republican tradition of history writing. So my answer, I guess, would be that the aspect of indigeneity in much of European history writing is not so significant in comparison to some of the colonial contexts outside of Europe. Some of you, I guess, could tell me more about how this looks in the Basque case, because I suspect with the Basque being in a way such a sort of separate bit of Europe, it might look different. I simply don't know.
Sí, bueno, yo no, en realidad no quería hacer una pregunta, sino plantear solo una reflexión. Me ha interesado mucho el marco teórico que ha planteado el profesor Berchetti. Solo quería decir que a mí me parece que, aunque entiendo efectivamente las dificultades que planteaba el profesor Enrique Pujol, que yo creo que sí que es en gran medida un marco teórico que puede o que debería poder aplicarse al estudio del caso español. El problema fundamental que yo veo es que, en este sentido creo que también la reflexión va por ese camino, en el caso español el proceso de deconstrucción del nacionalismo español o el proceso de deconstrucción del relato de la identidad nacional española está todavía en gran medida por hacer, y entonces añadir ahí la historiografía, la renovación de la propia historiografía además de las otras naciones, pues se convierte en más difícil. Sin embargo, el marco teórico es perfectamente, en mi opinión, es perfectamente aplicable y además perfectamente reconocible. Por ejemplo, ahora están empezando a incorporarse los efectos de los estudios sobre el imperio, lo ha señalado además el profesor Berger, los trabajos postcoloniales al propio caso español. Otra cosa es si eso provoca o no provoca el descentramiento de la propiedad de la nación española, que eso a lo mejor no se ha hecho. Pero creo que el marco teórico en ese sentido sí que es perfectamente aplicable, pienso.
Than a question, but if I understand it correctly, the argument was that it might be good to move towards greater deconstruction also of the smaller national historiographies within multinational states. And I mean, I think that is very true. I think, as I tried to explain with Norman Davis, and at the same time as he deconstructs English national history, he really essentializes Welsh and Scottish national history, and I simply don't know enough about Basque or Catalan or Galician national history, but I think there is a great danger that, especially if you come from a period where your national history was repressed or not foregrounded, that you have a great sense that it is important to write that national history in some form, to paraphrase Ranke, as it actually happened. And therefore to move to a kind of problematical empiricism or positivism or seeking to essentialize particular parts of your national history. I guess the question is it asking too much of people who are just about, so keen to find their national history to immediately deconstruct it again? I remember when we started the European Science Foundation program in 2003 on the writing of national histories, we, that is a group of historians rooted in the West, of course were thinking of deconstructing national histories, of trying to say, well, a lot of these ideas about national histories are deeply problematical, etc. And we had a number of colleagues from Eastern Europe, from places such as Latvia or Slovakia, who came to us in the hope that we would in fact help them to write their national histories. So, because I mean, in some respects they say, well, we've just found our national history, we need to construct our national history, we don't need to deconstruct our national history. I guess, but I mean, certainly from a personal perspective, I would have great sympathies with attempts not to essentialize national history, but to try and come to more reflective forms of national history. What I try to argue for, more playful forms of national history, where you avoid the kind of essentialisms that inevitably lead to a problematical setup of dichotomies of them versus us.
It's a question regarding the it's a question regarding the Britishness aspect of the British national history. I'm sorry I arrived late, so you might have talked about in the early section of your paper. I wonder whether there is a particular peculiarity to the British case, in the sense that British national history reflects an idea of Britishness, which is not common in Europe. Frenchness, Spanishness are all different. This relates to the project of cultural homogenization that each state has tried to promote against the minorities. Today, if you go to Britain, you find two major far-right parties with two different visions of British identity. One is the BNP, the British National Party, which denies everything, denies the Welsh identity, denies it's based on denial. It's an old-style racist state. And then there is the English Defence League, which is apparently a much more powerful and dangerous force, which is based on civilization idea, but recognizes there is an English identity, recognizes there is a Scottish identity, and I would say they are trying to push a kind of secession from the center on the part of the English, based on civilization. And I know that this sense of Englishness is not only for the far right, it's shared by people in the center and in the left. So I wanted to know whether this is reflected in different vision of history, and this can be related to the past attempt of the state to homogenize their people. I want to know whether you can compare also this to the rest of the European state-making experience, in which one single culture was imposed by force through assimilation, typically in the case of France and Italy as well, encountering sometimes opposition, sometimes not. Thank you.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think you're right in pointing out that there are obviously very different state traditions when it comes to state building and the homogenization of different cultures within the boundaries of those states. This also famously changes over time. I mean, if you take the example of the Romanov Empire, and even if you go to Helsinki today, it's one of the few cases I know where on the major square of a capital city you find a statue of a foreign emperor. In that case, I think it's Alexander I who gave the constitution to Finland, and therefore is still seen as a sort of positive cult figure. And in the early 19th century, most of the Fennomans, the Finnish nationalists, were pro-Russian and anti-Swedish. But as the Russian policies changed towards the end of the 19th century, most of the Finnish nationalists became anti-Russian and pro-Swedish again. The kind of homogenization policies produced responses which were very different at different times. But the policies themselves were also very different. If you look at Prussia, for example, and the policies towards the Polish minority in the Prussian East, heavily repressive. Arguably in Britain, I would say, there was always more of a kind of liberal attitude towards cultural differences. And famously, of course, Scotland retained several of institutions from its legal code to its school system, its educational system, to its money, that were always separate from England, and is, I think, a sign of a kind of more liberal attitude on the British Isles towards these homogenization policies. I would also say that in that respect there have been traditions of stateless national, well, no, there are sort of traditions of identifying, both in Scotland and in Wales, with a kind of cultural Scottishness and a cultural Welshness, which did not translate into demands for separate nation states. So in general, I would say the more liberal a state tradition is in multinational states and empires, the less the nationalist response from sub-state nationalisms. Also, I think the Habsburg Empire is a good example of that. I think there is a kind of, if you like, inverse relationship between cultural homogenization and the rise of sub-state nationalisms. But I don't think, I mean, in that sense, I would say Britain is perhaps different from Europe in that it was a more liberal regime.
Sorry, is it interesting that John Stuart Mill, who was one of the apologists of modernization, of homogenization, referred to not just to Britain, but several societies worldwide?
I'm not sure. I mean, you have to explain a bit more. Why do you think that Mill was a...
John Stuart Mill classically defined it, so I think it has counter...
No, but I mean, Mill is of course a very complex thinker who, you know, said different things at different times again. Which, but you were referring to what specifically?
Or representation. I think you talk about the needs to for a state to be represented by an homogeneous constituency.
Yes, I mean, in that sense, he is a sort of forerunner of the later liberal imperialist position, which argued along sort of similar lines for. But I would still think that the British political tradition is more liberal, is more willing to accept cultural differences than many of the other European states in the 19th century.